face is like a script, a scroll, a text on which life leaves its imprint.
The face is so important in human life because it's the way we communicate with other people. People are very sensitive about their features and about the image they present to the world in general.
I don't like my teeth. I prefer my nose to be straight.
I don't like my side view.
I don't like my chin, which is why I wear a beard.
I've got a small mouth.
I don't like my eyes very much. They're a bit shifty sometimes.
Don't like my freckles. My nose. It's too big.
I don't think I'm very good looking.
You know, you walk into a bus depot or a train station and find all these bits of photographs strewn around. Perverse, discarded lookalikes, faces that have been ripped up and thrown away by their owners. But when they went into the photo booth, what ideal image did these people have in mind? "2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Plato, drawing from ideas passed down from the ancient civilizations of Egypt, India, and China, formulated a law which suggested that there is an ideal which is directly related to nature. His theory of the golden mean, a series of fixed geometric mathematical rules, suggested that beauty and excellence are created by the qualities of measure and proportion. Geometry and numbers seem to be the key to harmony, the basis of musical scales, of art and architecture, even setting standards for the perfect human face." "2,000 years later, numbers have multiplied, have become information, language. Quantum mechanics, physics, theories of chaos have changed our ideas about the world. But forget higher mathematics for a moment. Let's look at a late 20th century yardstick for measuring feminine beauty. I mean Bo Derek. I mean the perfect 10.
We all have a notion of how attractive we are. Say on a scale from 0 to 10, I might think I'm about 4, for example.
5. 5?
Oh, about -2 probably.
I give 8 points.
Oh gosh, probably about a 5.
On a bad day, I'm a 2, and on a good day, I'm a 10.
People carry this notion around with them, and what they do is they seek out somebody just a little bit more attractive than they think they are.
I'd have to say a 6.
So I'm sitting in a restaurant with a friend, and we're waiting for a new boyfriend to arrive, and she's describing him, building him up until I expected some kind of Greek god to burst through the door. So finally, this guy walks in, and she goes, "It's him." And I couldn't believe it. He looked so totally ordinary. What is it that makes us fall in love with another human being, that blinds us, that transforms even the most ordinary face into a mysterious, endlessly fascinating landscape. We use the term face value, but what does it really mean? We value our face. We've learned to market a look, an image. We use it to buy, and we use it to sell. But what does it mean to sell ourselves? And more important, what does it mean to own ourselves, to own our own face? This is Madalena Adoni. Disembodied heads, like hers, idealized in marriage portraits, were sent around Europe as advertisements.
Har is 29 years of age, 5 foot 3 inches tall and single. She measures 33, 26, 36. She has a high school education and is a bank clerk. Na is 30 years of age, 5 foot 2 inches tall, a high school education and measures 31, 25, 33.
Today, Thai women smile into video cameras, hoping to convince a Western man to marry them. The customer makes a choice from a video selection of 100 smiles and sends off for his mail-order bride. How will they choose what they are looking for?
The features that seem to constitute attractiveness, that make one face more attractive than the other, are fairly well known in research now. The most important one is that the eyes are large compared to the face. Now, some people have small heads, some people have very large heads, but the important thing is that the eyes are large compared to that face. That's the most important thing by a long way. The second feature is that the forehead is high, is large compared to the lower part of the face. The third thing is, many people are not aware, but if you draw a line vertically down the face through the nose, and you compare the left half with the right half, in most people, the two halves of the face are fairly distinct. One can show this photographically.
But if you take half a face and flip it, instead of having one crossed eye, you've got two. So, what if you're not a Greek statue, not a video composite of perfection? How do we, the asymmetrical people, cope? How do we deal with being less than perfect?
I think in a business environment, and at work particularly, I think makeup helps. I think it helps to raise your self-esteem.
I wear on makeup a lot when I go out at night to make myself look older, and to cover up things like nasty spots or whatever.
Heavy makeup is not nice. Makeup should be artistic, light, creative, not vulgar.
You know, in Japanese beauty parlors, you can walk in, sit down, and they put your face up on a video monitor, and then they try on various electronic hairdos stored in the image banks. Could I try something sort of classical? Or actually, do you have anything a little more sporty? I mean, they have a huge selection of do's, so you can try them out on TV electronically before you take that next big step to cut.
It's a very extraordinary and ultimately very moving picture. And if we actually met an old man like that, our first reaction would be one of horror. I mean, such a terribly deformed nose. But the affection, by placing the grandson with the old man, it immediately sort of makes him human. And so we can relate to him as we might relate to a neighbor with a deformity in an immediate way. There are plenty of instances in art history of sitters having asked artists to change their nose or their eyes or their ears or whatever. But I think in this case, we must assume that the old man said, look, I want to be painted like this. I've got to live with this awful nose. I'm not ashamed of it. And my grandson's not frightened by it. Let's make a record. We all think we have pretty good ideas of what we look like, either from looking in the mirror in the morning or from snapshots taken on holiday, the most common sources of our knowledge of our external appearance.
We've all got family photos. Photos in albums, on mantelpieces, images of friends, grandma, grandpa, pictures of rituals and celebrations, moments from our private history, preserved and recorded.
I don't like the idea of photographing people using any sort of props. I like to concentrate on the face and its expression and neutralize the background. For me, as a photographer, it's an honest approach to portrait photography. There must be a respect for your sitter. Sometimes that can be quite difficult, but a picture's always given, it's never taken.
Turn and face round this way.
I find it rather disconcerting that Steve has concentrated nearly all his shots on the side of my face that I used to consider, when I worried about these things at all, was the bad side. How someone else would react to having a lens sort of 4 inches away from their nose, I can't imagine.
Now if you can lean down and look towards camera. Now look into camera.
I feel fairly insecure, which perhaps tells me something I didn't know about Steve's photography. I shan't know whether I feel emotionally exposed until I've seen the photograph, because I don't know what I'm giving away as I'm sitting here.
There's one that I really like, which is a soft. It's this one here, and I like the fact it's soft. It's gone soft. It's not really hard, and you can see every pore. It just gives a better feel to the picture to me. There's another one which is almost like a document of his face. It doesn't really excite me that much, but there's something about it I like.
Can a photograph be too honest? Can it show too much? Sometimes people look in Steve Pike's folio and say, I like your pictures, but I wouldn't want to be photographed like that myself. Not everyone wants to be portrayed, warts and all. Most of us want to be flattered.
Winston Churchill retired from the House of Commons, it was decided to present him with a portrait of himself, and the committee appointed to look for a painter landed on Graham Sutherland, who was probably the most distinguished British painter of his time.
So in Westminster Hall, fellow members paid their tribute.
On behalf of both Houses of Parliament, Prime Minister, I ask you to accept this portrait. The portrait
a remarkable example of modern art.
When the portrait was delivered to the Churchills, it was never seen again. And after the death of Lady Churchill, it was learnt that she'd had the portrait destroyed because it had upset Winston Churchill so much.
Expressions are the face's fleeting signals. They can mean 1,000 things. How do we learn to speak their language? Constantly moving, constantly changing, the human face is a sophisticated communication system, emphasizing, underlining, casting doubt. Sometimes we're more fluent with our faces than with words. Under the surface of our skin, a web of muscles work to make our feelings speak.
There are certain basic innate expressions of emotion, happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust, fear, and anger, and those are common to all mankind.
Sadness, surprise, disgust, fear, anger, happiness. Every face can say these things. These expressions, set for eternity in metal and stone, were made in the 18th century by an Austrian, Franz Messerschmitt. He wanted to know how our inner feelings show on our faces, untangle the mysteries of what an expression means. An eccentric Frenchman, Duchenne, went further. He wanted to study expressions divorced from feelings. So he placed electrodes on the faces of people he drew from the Parisian underworld. He found he could electrically produce a smile, a gasp, a stare. An amateur artist, Duchenne believed he could better the expressions painted by the old masters. He thought their work was flawed by a lack of physiological knowledge. So he left us a catalog of the expressions a face can make, a catalog that contemporary psychologists still find useful today. But of course, expression is much more complex than just motor response.
Each emotion can be in several grades of power. Smiling, for example, there can be the normal average kind of smile, which I'll try to do. There can be a too strong a smile, a false smile of greeting somebody you don't really want to speak to, kind of like that. And of course, there can be very subtle smiles that are often used to back up somebody in conversation. If you're talking to somebody and you want them to continue, you can either go, uh-huh, or you can give them a very small smile. I'll try to do it now, like that.
This is the face of Keith Waters, artist and computer scientist. He experiments with his own image as he tries to invent an alphabet of expressions. Then, he translates the anatomy of his face into a geometric skeleton and makes it move. Keith Waters builds computer faces capable of far more than android expressions. Soon we'll be able to talk to a robot face to face. And this is the face we'll talk to.
Oh, sorry.
me.
But robot smiles are just microchips. Human smiles are filled with all kinds of mystery.
By purposely adopting an expression, such as a smile, this leads the body through the brain to actually produce the chemicals associated with smiling, i.e. happiness. And this recent research suggests that, for example, for people who are unhappy or depressed, if they actually go around smiling, this convinces the body that they're happy.
Overlying those innate expressions, there are display rules, ways in which we control the expression of emotion, and those are culturally variable.
The study reenacted here contrasted the expressions of Japanese and Americans. Students in each country sat alone in a room watching a series of stress films. Live-action scenes of surgical procedures, vacuum extraction births, and an aboriginal circumcision rite. Concealed video cameras showed almost identical facial expressions.
In Japan, there's said to be a taboo on expressing negative emotions in public, and they're said to be much more constrained about the emotions that they will display than perhaps, say, the Americans.
Later, in the same experiment, an investigator entered the room and sat facing the student while the stress films continued. Now, measurements showed the Japanese and Americans were no longer the same. Cultural rules for managing facial expressions were operative. The Japanese looked more polite, showed more smiling to cover negative feelings. This study was the first to clearly show that facial expression is both universal and culturally determined. The first to help unravel the dual influences of biology and culture. In private, biologically based universal expressions. In public, culturally based differences in the control of expression.
Your face is not only a language, but it can be a dialect, which is understood by people inside the culture and not by people outside the culture. You see, what is sulkiness might be despair. What is sulkiness for whites, I mean, might be despair for black, might be a sense of giving up, hopelessness. But it's labeled sulkiness, or it could be labeled aggression, it could be labeled but anything negative, because people use their own culture as a norm. And in that culture, they learn to filter the expression of other people.
The human face can show thousands of different emotions. I'm really trying to capture a variety of emotions in my work. The type of face I'm interested in really is the more craggy type of person from the conventionally beautiful person. Right, can you show me your teeth a bit and really stick your neck out? Right, think of someone that you really hate. Right, that's it, that's enough, that's great. Right. Just your teeth, I just want your teeth. Right, that's brilliant. I tend to work on a portrait like this quite academically and just make it just a straight portrait, and then when I get into the painting, when I start painting, that's when I start to distort it, and there's almost an element of caricature that comes into it. So I try to be careful not to make it too much of a caricature. I'm just trying to create an atmosphere, some kind of atmosphere in the work, something that will move people, whether it's you know, in an emotional way, whether it's in a kind of sorrowful way, a sad way. or something that will something that will excite people as well, something powerful. I think there's too much blandness about. I'm not interested in society portraits anyway. That's one thing that doesn't interest me in the slightest. I'm interested in real people with character.
Wouldn't it be great if you could stop time, freeze your face at a particularly flattering moment? Sometimes that's the way a portrait works, but what if it backfires? Take Dorian Gray. He had his portrait painted as a young man, then hid it away. In the story, the painting began to take on a creepy life of its own. It cracked, corroded, oozed. It reflected every evil thing Gray said and did, while Gray himself looked as innocent as the day he was painted. Does the painting reflect the person, or the person the painting? It's never black and white. Will the real Mr. Gray please stand up? Our faces hide things as well as reveal them. So, can you tell when your lover is lying? How about your boss? Do their faces give them away?
Whenever I look at someone, the first thing I pay attention are the eyes, and I can tell whether you are lying or not, whether you are being honest or not.
If I sort of look at my boyfriend and that, I couldn't really tell whether he was lying or not.
Some of my friends I can tell when they're lying, just because I know them quite well. They're not good at hiding things.
It depends on how reliable the person is. Sometimes they're very good at hiding things, so it's not easy to see.
It's easy for me to determine whether my boyfriend is lying because he looks away. I mean, that's kind of an obvious thing to say, but it's you can pick it up straight away.
I like to think that I can tell when people are telling the truth, but I've certainly been wrong in the past.
Mr. Harold Philby, on the right, holds a press conference to deny charges that he was involved in the disappearance of Burgess and McLean. The 43-year-old...
Well, here we have a particularly fascinating sequence with Kim Philby, the master spy who later defected to Russia, and he's being asked about his involvement as the third man, and gives quite a number of clues which suggest that deception may be taking place.
McLean, are you satisfied with that clearance that he gave you?
Yes, I am.
Well, if there was a third man, were you, in fact, the third man?
No, I was not.
It's very interesting here, the contrast between his facial movement and his body movement. You can sometimes tell about deception from body movements, that you can control the face more carefully because of its greater sending power. You're more careful what you do with your facial expression. And sometimes people inadvertently leak through their body movement. They're actually deceiving. And Philby's body movements are quite nervous here. He actually adjusts the position of his jacket twice, and he adjusts the position of his trousers twice before answering this question. Facially, he seems confident. He responds to the question very quickly. There's no sort of revealing pause. He gives the direct denial.
And were you, in fact, the third man?
No, I was not.
The face can, however, leak information as well. And what's particularly fascinating about this answer is that after Philby's first denial, he gives the denial, and then he actually seems to stick his tongue in his cheek. If you like, it's a sort of literal slip of the tongue.
Each face has two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. And yet each of us has the ability to recognize a face we know in the middle of a crowd of strangers. How do we do it? How do we know? This is a machine learning to see. A machine learning to recognize a specific human being. This is Matthew Turk, a scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Every time his computer recognizes him, it calls to him, writing his initials up on the screen.
Well, if faces are recognition cues, how do we recognize them? When do we begin to recognize them? Babies, that's for sure, they begin to recognize a face remarkably early on. First of all, just as a face, and then quite quickly as their mother's specific individual face. And you can do a simple but very effective experiment where you simply take a card and you draw on that some stylized items of a human face, some eyes, a nose, and a smile. And you don't need much to make a baby smile. 2 eyes and a big grin, and that's a face to a baby.
The shape of the head is the most important thing, not the placement of the features or the eyes or the mouth. It's the complete shape of the head. And if you get that wrong, then they're not recognizable. You can be too clever. I mean, you can distort. I mean, say someone's got a very long face, you can distort that sideways if you're a clever enough caricaturist. I mean, some of the people that work at Spitting Image are extraordinarily skillful. But it's discouraged, because if you get too far away from the basic shape, then the recognition factor's gone. Everybody carries around the iconography of someone that's in the media a lot. I mean, it has to be in their heads, otherwise they wouldn't recognize it, especially when you think some of the distortions are, you know, pretty outrageous. They must be carrying around a picture somewhere in their head. That's why they recognize it.
Think of all the people you can recognize. But how many of these people have you actually seen in person? We depend on being able to recognize faces, but given the number of possibilities, there are going to be some repeats. Imagine living in a world where you couldn't recognize anyone, where you didn't know your lover's face, where you could pass your parents in the street and not know who they were, where you could go to the school playground and not recognize your own child. But what if your daughter was kidnapped, stolen? The years pass, her features change, she grows up. Would you know her? Could you describe your own daughter to someone who's looking for her?
We now have the capability to provide to the American public the photographs of that child as he or she would look today.
In a strange alliance, the FBI has teamed up with artists to artificially age photographs of missing children, to imagine what their future faces would be like.
Dee Schofield was kidnapped at the age of 12 in Florida 6 years ago. At the request of the Schofield family, this composite update of Dee was composed to help in the continuing search for their daughter.
This girl disappeared. Her photo was aged by a computer. As a result, she was found. But what if the police get there too late? If the clues lead them to evidence of a more frightening kind?
Quite often, of course, we do recover dead bodies that we can't identify. Unfortunately, quite often, their faces are none too pretty. Sadly, sometimes, of course, the bodies are so badly decomposed that all we're left with is the skull or partial skull.
Police artist Richard Neve creates faces from the skull outwards. 8 years ago, workmen found an unidentified skeleton in the back garden of a house. Muscle by muscle, Richard Neve built it into a face. It turned out to belong to a missing teenage girl. 2 men were subsequently convicted of the murder of Karen Price. You've been watching my face for some time now. Could you describe the shape of my eyes? What about the nose? Or the mouth? If you saw this police photo fit, would my name come to mind?
It hasn't really been updated since 1975, so therefore many of the features are outdated, particularly the hairstyles. There are some sort of problems with building faces. With the photo fit, for example, the actual commutation of pieces and the faces that we can build is limitless. One of the problems, of course, is that some of those bits, when they come together, produce faces that don't look very lifelike, simply because, as far as the anatomy is concerned, it would be impossible for those sort of features to come together. Well, here in the UK, the Home Office have produced EFIT, which stands for Electronic Facial Identification Technique. One of the advantages of EFIT is that it actually makes use of the way that memory works. The majority of us, if we actually closed our eyes and tried to recall feature by feature, someone who's very close to us, a husband, a wife, boyfriend, or something of that nature, we would be struggling, I suspect, in certain areas. What exactly are her eyes like? We quite often don't even know the colour of their wife's or husband's eyes, but certainly don't know whether they've got an inner fold or an outer fold on the top lid, and sort of minute details such as that. And yet if we were driving down the road and saw that person standing at a bus stop, perhaps 100 yards, 200 yards away, the chances are we'd recognise them straight away.
With EFIT, you don't get isolated features. You get the chance to invent a whole face on a computer.
Once I've established some kind of a description from my witness, and I've gathered all the details I can, and I've asked all the questions that I can, then I'm ready to begin with EFIT.
He's got gray hair. No, a little bit less hair. And smaller eyes. And the nose a little longer. A longer face. No, that's too long. A little bit on the broader side.
Your witness may appear agitated, or she may even cry in some circumstances, because the image is starting to look like the man she's trying to describe.
Newspapers are filled with the faces of serial killers like Charles Manson and Peter Sutcliffe. Media can make people look bad, literally. The image is degraded, the lighting is terrible, and it's like the criminal is caught in the act, and there just wasn't enough light at the scene of the crime, and obviously there was no stylist or makeup artist available either. But are we sophisticated enough to identify a criminal when he or she is, let's say, really well lit? Some pancake makeup, maybe a white collar, a big smile. The criminal who looks right at you, right into the camera, and lies through his teeth. We'll be right back. So who is this guy? A college lecturer? An architect? A television producer?
My witness would sometimes tell me, "Oh, the face is fine, everything's great, but he looks too nice. This guy looked really evil." This I can do simply just by rotating an eye, slanting it diagonally, ever so subtly.
Because we expect burglars or robbers to look in a certain way, then quite often when we are asked to build faces, the witnesses will actually expect them to look like criminals.
So what is a criminal face? Have we always believed we can tell what evil looks like? In the Victorian era, criminologists discovered the new science of photography. Some prisoners had their features forcibly recorded as the scientists set out to confirm their own prejudice about the criminal face. This was the birth of the mugshot. Grainy, black and white, grim motifs we still recognize today.
They claimed to find a number of characteristic signs which allowed you to identify a criminal. Things like the shape of the earlobe, the size of the nose, having a jutting jaw, and the like. Many people felt that you could identify particular human attributes from the face, from the way in which people looked. And we still think that. We believe that. We say that in our common conversation. He's got a kind face. He's got a nasty face.
What if you thought everyone could be judged and classified by their features? We don't believe that today, do we?
I think if you, as a woman, for example, you look acute, I think it's very easy and very tempting for men in particular to think they are very soft and very cute in their character.
There is a gut reaction in most of us which reacts to how a person looks.
You can definitely see a person's character through their face, without doubt.
In 1773, the German philosopher Lavater published his 100 Principles of Physiognomy, expressed in thousands of renderings of the face. Today, these drawings look like hopelessly crude caricatures based on the economic and political realities of his moment. The white male landowner looked like this.
Reserved, firm, confident, of a high brow. So, how do I look? Apollo Belvedere or what?
On the other hand, he explained, women
with brown, hairy, or bristly warts are commonly industrious, active, good housewives. Too bad none of us housewives got to write our versions.
Honey, dinner's ready. This book on physiognomy was the Bible of the so-called science of judging people by their faces. In the 18th century, everyone believed it. A nose was sincere or lacking in tact. A mouth was generous or far too voluptuous. No self-respecting Parisian, for example, would dream of making a friend or hiring a servant without consulting the book. The physiognomists believe that if your face looked like a fish, then your ways were fishy. If your nose was sharp, then so was your style. The real status symbol, though, was a face reminiscent of the Greek ideal.
You know, as a kid, my mother used to say, "You've got such a high forehead. It's a sign of intelligence. Don't hide it, feature it." And she'd pull my hair straight back into a really tight ponytail, and it was so tight it stretched my mouth into this hideous, permanent grin. So I looked pretty smart, but the most I could say were things like, "Have a nice day."
Beyond physiognomy was phrenology, the study of the skull. Victorian headhunters scoured the world, measuring, checking, taking plaster casts, collecting as many different types as possible.
The collection was really formed by the Edinburgh Phrenological Society from about 1820 through to about 1860 or 1870. what they thought was that there was a quite clear relationship between the bumps on a person's head and their features. Features from the point of view of whether the person was aggressive, whether the person was very passive, things like that. Some people who were great intellects maybe had a very large forehead, and they thought that this was why there might be a relationship between the two.
So the idea was that the brain is divided into 27 different cerebral organs, and the size of the organs affects the shape of the skull. So look, here's the identity, organs, secretiveness. Oh, and look, here's what they call the cautiousness zone. But there are a few flaws in this theory. Let's try an experiment. Let's say something falls on your head. A cautiousness bump would swell up whether you have a label on it or not. See? You've learned something about safety.
I must admit there are still phrenological societies both in this country and in the States. But as far as the actual science is concerned, I'm afraid even in the 1810s, 1820s, many people were really very skeptical about it, because there is really no fundamental relationship between the contours of the surface of the brain and any of these characteristics that they were considering.
Unable to explain, the Victorians decided to count. Humanity was there to be labeled. Everyone could be catalogued and graded. Some people were rare. Some people were common.
It seemed that there must be a universal theory of some kind, which was that there was somewhere a pure high form of human being, the eugenic form of human being. And sometimes there was a throwback. Things went wrong. People, as it were, slipped down the evolutionary ladder.
If you were born with a problem, which made you look different, you were called a degenerate, an alien creature from an earlier evolutionary stage. You didn't fit. You didn't matter, except as an exhibit in a scientific freak show, a piece of pathological exotica. Add pseudoscience to prejudice, and you produce the final folly. The idea that you can breed the perfect human face from the right selection of high-class genes.
Eugenic, in fact, means good genes, good inheritance. In fact, the name Eugene was originated from that very period. The idea that if you could find a particularly meritorious male, you should try and match him with a particularly able female and mate them together. And perhaps even more urgent, he suggested, if you got men and women who are defective in one way or another, you should prevent them from reproducing. Well, the notorious and tragic case which really led to the end of eugenics was, of course, the Nazi experiment. Many German geneticists and anthropologists seized on the opportunity of power which they were given to claim that they could identify, for example, harmful genes, genes for madness, genes for Jewishness, and killed tens of thousands of people as a result.
A terrifying program of racial selection was exacted throughout Europe. Children were snatched from their parents in the occupied territories and tested for racial purity. Those who failed the tests were exterminated in concentration camps. But some, whose blonde hair and blue eyes matched the Aryan ideal, were taken back to Germany. There they were placed in special baby farms, or Lebensborn, homes for children intended for use as breeding stock.
Meine Mutti, die musste mich ins Heim bringen, weil sie da Arbeit suchen musste.
My mummy had to look for work, so she put me in an orphanage.
Und die SS
And the SS came to choose children who were blonde and blue-eyed, and I was unfortunately amongst those. I was kidnapped from the orphanage by a Mr. Rao, and he took me to a children's home in Innsbruck. And he had 2 children by the hand, and he still wanted to choose between 3 other children. And he saw me, I remember this exactly, in the hall. I was sitting in the middle on a little chair, and he said, "I like the little blonde girl, I'll take her with me." I didn't know what it was about and what it meant. I was too little then. I only know that I cried a lot, that I wanted to stay in the home with the other children there, because they really tore me away. They were all killed. That's what I was told later. The children were killed, all of them.
Your face is not you. Your face is only a part of you. There are other things and deeper things. There's the interior self. The face is a sort of repository for the exterior self. And it's the interior person that's important and valid.
As I grow older, I try to sort of read the soul of the people. It's not easy, but I think as I grow up, I'm getting better to see the inside of the people.
Our faces are really our only reflection of our emotional inner lives that's visible to the outside. My name is Nancy Burson. I make portraits of people who don't exist, except that I'm sure that these faces exist somewhere since there are 5 billion of us on the planet. My husband and I make composites by combining several faces together with a computer. Some of the pieces challenge our notion of what is beautiful and what is ugly and what is normal, but to me they're all beautiful.
The implications of Nancy Burson's work extend beyond art. A version of her software is being used to help doctors to predict the results of reconstructive surgery on the skull. Scientists are now performing imaginary operations on artificial faces.
We are all composites, certainly of our parents, but also on a molecular level. Every atom in our bodies were once parts of stars. On an individual level, each of us are composites of our emotions, each of us being fearful and courageous, intelligent and stupid, and beautiful and ugly simultaneously. And then as we mature, we become composites of our previous decades, plus our present. So these works for me are really about unification and about compromise.
So what is the face of the future? A sci-fi fantasy? A cybernetic nightmare? Or when we finally have the technical ability to gene splice ourselves into our idols and heroes, will there be 1 million look-alike Mao Zedongs? 1 trillion identical New Age Buddhas wandering around? Or in 10,000 years from now, like some people suggest, are we all going to have pooled our genes, melting into the definitive, ultimate, genetic human face? Of course, when most of us think of the future, 10,000 years is really stretching it. Maybe our buck teeth or big brown eyes will live on in the features of our descendants. On the other hand, forget the crystal ball bit. All you have to do is turn around and look right in the mirror. The future of your face is the one you're creating right now.